Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out on a Monday morning to hear me. I'll hopefully make it worth your time today. My lecture is called The Tonic of Wildness, Boston Writers on City and Country. And because I'm an academic, I have to riff on my title a little bit here right at the beginning. The tonic of wildness is a phrase from Henry David Thoreau, who I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a minute here. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about it is that word tonic, right? A tonic implies something restorative, right? Something curative, which in turn implies that there's some sort of an illness or ailment, right, that needs to be cured. So that idea of wilderness, wildness, as restorative and curative is going to be at the center of a lot of what I talk about today. The other part of this that I need to talk about a little bit is the city and country thing. Because country I really mean in a couple of different ways. I mean that contrast between urban and rural. I mean that contrast between civilization and settlement and the sort of wilderness beyond. But I also mean country in the sense of nation here, right? Because what you have in this era of the 19th century that I'm mostly going to be focusing on today is a very self-conscious moment in the creation of American intellectual life, right? I think we have to understand the emergence of Boston as an American cultural center, which it truly was in the 19th century, sort of the hub of cultural activity, of academia, of scholarship, of American writing, really sort of preeminent above any other city, even New York during this period. We have to understand that in the context of the kind of long-standing inferiority complex that the American intellectual had in comparison to Europe, right? And a big part of that is the relatively ahistorical nature of America compared to these capitals of Europe that have hundreds, thousands of years of history behind them, right? Washington Irving famously said, it's difficult to write American ghost stories because nobody's been dead long enough to be a ghost, right? And so when you have this emergence of Boston with its great library, the Athenaeum, with its great universities, with this atmosphere in which it seemed to many that everybody was a lecturer, everybody was an academic, everybody was a writer. Bret Harte, the Western writer, famously said that if you shot an arrow into the air over the Charles River from Cambridge, you'd hit a writer on the other side, right? Edgar Allan Poe, who was both of the kind of American intelligentsia and then also sort of critical of it, called Boston Frogpondium because of this chorus of croaking intellectuals who would never shut up, right? Who would essentially always be talking. Oscar Wilde said, and I believe that every American is a lecturer, right? Because of this sense that in this preeminent city of American culture, there was a sort of vibrant intellectual life. So what I'm going to talk about today is the effort of a particular group of American intellectuals to forge an American intellectual identity. Because in response to that inferiority complex I was talking about, American intellectuals who cared about this sort of thing had a couple of options. They could emulate European intellectuals. They could sort of apologize for not being European and write for European audiences. Or they could do what Emerson wanted to do, which was to create themselves entirely anew as intellectuals and to maintain or establish and maintain what he called an original relationship to the universe. I'm going to talk about what that means in a minute as well. I want to, though, counterintuitively, begin my lecture proper, now that I've moved on past the title, with a poem, I believe you should have a handout with this on it, by a writer who was not a Boston writer, but who captures this sort of spirit that I want to talk about today as succinctly and beautifully as anybody I can think of. So this is called When I Heard the Learned Astronomer by Walt Whitman. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures, were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon, unaccountable, I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. One of the things we need to understand about this period that I'm going to be talking about is that we're emerging from, in some ways, the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment, that era of sort of intellectual and scientific renewal, an era of remarkable scientific progress, an era of sort of philosophical revolutions, right? The era of revolution in a very real sort of global sense. The way I think to understand that is this sort of emerging primacy of optimism about the power of the human intellect to understand and in some ways to master nature. And I always think about, I know it's sort of reductive to think about the sort of representative men theory of history, but I always think about Benjamin Franklin when I think about the Enlightenment. And I think about one of his countless accomplishments in particular, and that was the invention of the lightning rod, okay? Back in sort of Puritan America, if someone's house was struck by lightning, they would put out or fight the fires in the adjacent houses, but they just let that house burn. Because the idea was, well, God smote that house for a reason, right? The will of God is enacted here. Ben Franklin, very practically, said, you know what? Given what I've learned, if we put a little piece of metal up there on the roof, then that's not going to happen anymore. And so you have this man who captures and tames God's holy fire and essentially changes the whole paradigm of how people thought about their relationship to agency, to the divine, and to the sort of power of science, right? Now that's a wonderful thing, and it led to this wave of optimism about what human beings could accomplish, how much control they actually had over their own destinies. The other side of that, though, is the kind of rebellion that we see in romantic writers like Walt Whitman. Romanticism, in a lot of ways, is a kind of response to the Enlightenment, for all the wonderful things that the Enlightenment brought with it. Writers like Poe, writers like Whitman, saw alongside that a kind of loss of, for lack of a better term, the magic of nature, right? Whitman saying here, when you see, instead of the stars themselves, the charts and diagrams and the explanations and the sort of scientific reasoning that imposes order on the chaos of the universe, he grows tired and sick. And the language becomes so beautiful here towards the end, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. That perfect silence, I think, is important here, because what he's getting at there is the sublime. This sense of wonder at nature, this sense of emotion that cannot be channeled into words, right? That when you're taming God's holy fire is difficult to capture, right? So that kind of romanticism is going to be important to what we talk about today as well. And I think that kind of sets the stage for where I'll be going next. As I said earlier, the American intellectual had to work against this perception of America as a kind of hinterland, as a kind of baby nation, as a place without intellectual history. The most dominant way of doing that up until this era that I'm talking about today, which is really sort of the 1810s up there about the 1850s, was to emulate British writers, emulate European writers, and write for European audiences, right? Emerson, though, sort of emerges as a new kind of American intellectual and calls for a new kind of American intellectual, right? In The American Scholar, Emerson lays out this whole sort of philosophy of what the American scholar is supposed to be. And I've got a few quotations there that I want to go through and talk about a little bit on that other handout that we gave you today. He says from the beginning of that essay, "Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres or tombs of the fathers. The foregoing generations beheld God face to face, we through their eyes. Why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe? This idea of the original relation to the universe is central to everything Emerson ever said, and central to the Transcendentalists, this larger movement that he was sort of a founding member of, was all about. That idea that even among scholars, right, Emerson was enormously well-read, extraordinarily well-educated, that inherited knowledge was somehow tyrannical, that it imposed a pre-existing understanding and framework on a world that those people who wrote those books had no better claim to understand than the intellectually alive contemporary person, right? When you look at nature through the prism of inherited knowledge, it hems it in. It limits your understanding. You see it as others have seen it. And what Emerson was calling for was for the American intellectual to have the kind of confidence and the kind of self-reliance, another of his famous essays, to look at nature unfiltered and to see in it truths that had yet to be discovered. So Emerson's answer to this sort of American inferiority complex is, let's start over, right? We are not moribund followers of the past. We are not disciples of this sort of inherited bank of knowledge. We see things the way that we see them, and we see truths there that no one's seen before. And what we see is at least as valid as what anyone's seen before. He talks about books in The American Scholar, and he talks about what happens when we sort of fetishize the book. In that second quotation, yet hence arises a grave mischief, the sacredness which attaches to the act of creation, the act of thought, is instantly transferred to the record. The poet chanting was felt to be a divine man. Henceforth the chant is divine also. The writer was a just and wise spirit. Henceforward it is settled that the book is perfect, as love of the hero corrupts into worship of the statue. Instantly the book becomes noxious. The guide is a tyrant. We sought a brother, and lo, a governor. That contrast between brother and governor is important here, right? He didn't say don't read books. He didn't say reject all the knowledge that's come before. What he resisted was the tyranny of inherited knowledge that hems in our ability to think originally and have an original relationship with the universe. One of the things I think that's so interesting about Emerson too, and to some extent the other transcendentalists, is the way that they sort of anticipate the postmodern understanding of human identity as sort of culturally defined and culturally created. We are the sum of all these influences, conscious and otherwise, that we've observed, that we've been shaped by, right? The difference between Emerson and the more sort of defeatist postmodernists is that Emerson believed that this could be overcome, and that was the goal of the American intellectual. And in his famous essay, Nature, he captures this in a very sort of memorable way. I have this quote on the handout. In the woods, he said, we return to reason and faith. There I feel that nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity leaving me my eyes, which nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air, and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. This is the kind of dude Emerson was. He talked like this, he wrote like this, right? With this sort of effusive sense of human possibility. If my pre-existing notions are getting in the way of my genuine connection with nature and with God, well, then I'll empty myself of those things. I'll become a transparent eyeball, right? The extent to which that's possible is highly dubious, right? Can we really empty ourselves and see things completely originally? But he believed we could. And really behind this whole sort of transcendentalist movement is this inchoate sense that there's something beyond that humanity is capable of achieving somehow, right? One of the things that a lot of artists and a lot of writers found sort of unnourishing, I suppose, about Enlightenment values was the focus on practicality. Urban centers were products, in America anyway, were products of the Enlightenment for the most part. A focus on public works, a focus on infrastructure, a focus on practicality, a focus on financial and economic stability and success and growth, All those things are wonderful, but they bled the soul dry, Emerson thought. Emerson has a whole section in one of his essays when he talks about the nature of work. And he says, we become our jobs, essentially. And we do that when we become the worker rather than the man working, as he put it. We become like these dismembered parts of a body. He said, you could be a good finger, you could be a good elbow, perhaps, but not a whole person, if what you are is your job, and what you measure your success by is financial or economic success. The soul was what was important to Emerson. And how do you nourish the soul? How do you transcend? What do you transcend? Well, the transcendentalists weren't real good at nailing that down. But there was that sense that there is something more that, through an original relationship to the universe, we can reach. And the place to find it was in the wilderness. Getting away from the city, getting away from people, getting away from the influences that might shape us and might stunt our growth. That's what the tonic of wildness is all about, right? Being able to become this sort of transparent eyeball. Now, along with this is a kind of radical individualism that is both fascinating and potentially troubling if we misunderstand it. Emerson famously in Self-Reliance says, whoso would be a man, very gendered language, it's the time, right? Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of our own mind. No law can be sacred to me but that of my own nature. A lot of people look at this and they think, well, he's being a nihilist. He's saying essentially a kind of do what thou wilt, so may it be kind of philosophy of following what you want to do, a kind of radical selfishness. I think that's misunderstanding Emerson. I think underlying all of this is maybe a crushingly naive optimism about human nature, which is really sort of Socratic in a lot of ways, really Platonic, right, in the tradition of classical Greek thinkers. To know the good is to do the good. If we can open ourselves up to truly understand the universe, then we will behave in ways that are ethical and good. And if we don't come to understand our own ethics and our own morality, then it's all artificial. There's no meaning to it, right? So all of it comes down to both sort of intellectual activity and the soul and morals and ethics. All of it comes down to this sense of trusting the self and a kind of individual relationship to nature. Now, Emerson attracted a number of followers, sort of intellectual disciples, many of whom went to Brook Farm and started a kind of a commune and tried to put some of his philosophies into action. The most famous, though, who actually practically applied some of Emerson's ideas was Henry David Thoreau, right? Famously, Henry David Thoreau goes for 2 years to live in a cabin in the woods, relies entirely on himself. Well, at least that's the way that he sort of pitched it. He spent a lot of time on Emerson's couch during that time. But for the most part, right, his whole idea was to rely on himself, on his ability to cultivate, on his ability to take from nature what he needs and nothing more. Thoreau was very sort of Emersonian in his thought, although they argued quite a bit over the years. But I have a couple of quotations from him that I want us to look at as well, that I think captures some of this. Our village life, or city life for that matter, would stagnate if it were not for the unexplored forests and meadows which surround it. We need the tonic of wildness, to wade sometimes in marshes where the bittern and the meadow hen lurk, and hear the booming of the snipe, to smell the whispering sedge where only some wilder and more solitary fowl builds her nest, and the mink crawls with its belly close to the ground. At the same time that we are earnest to explore and learn all things, we require that all things be mysterious and unexplorable, that land and sea be infinitely wild, unsurveyed and unfathomed by us because unfathomable. We can never have enough of nature. Directly contrasting the kind of Enlightenment idea that, yes, if we look hard enough and we apply ourselves rationally and scientifically, we can see the patterns in all these things. We can quantify. We can master. We can ultimately understand the world as God does. Thoreau says no. It has to be unfathomable. It has to be beyond our ability to understand, or else there'll be no drive for us to live and to seek to understand, right? Now, there is, of course, something wildly impractical about this whole way of thinking. Embracing the idea of the incomprehensibility of nature, chasing a kind of transcendence that nobody can even put into words, that is valuable in part because it can't be put into words. But that to me is also kind of moving when we're thinking about this kind of a radical individualistic quest. I want to follow up with the most famous quotation from Thoreau, which gives a sense of how passionately he believed in this sort of a project of self-creation and understanding through nature. He says, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, to see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation, unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms." Pretty inspirational in a lot of ways. And as a kind of manifesto of self-creation, a pretty drastic departure from what we see, and again, the sort of preeminent Enlightenment man, Ben Franklin. I don't know if any of y'all had to read or ever did read of your own accord Ben Franklin's autobiography. Anybody familiar with that? One of the chapters there is all about how he undertakes, and he's sort of tongue-in-cheek and self-parodying about this, but undertakes the project of perfecting himself. And so he makes these very sort of scientific charts and diagrams and says, okay, here are the flaws, the faults to which I am prone, and all I have to do, essentially, to perfect myself is just not do any of these things. It's that simple, right? A kind of variation on to know the good is to do it. Now, Franklin goes through this whole sort of series of rules for himself. And one of them, you know, to give a sense of the tone of the whole thing, is humility is one of the virtues that he has to pursue. And doing so, is his little note of that after that is emulate Jesus and Socrates, right? So he's sort of being funny about this whole thing, but there's also this capturing of this Enlightenment sense that, well, why shouldn't we be perfect? And that, in some ways, is a sort of repudiation of the Puritan idea, right, of original sin, and the fact that we're all fundamentally flawed from birth, that we're all marked and imperfect and can never be truly perfect. Franklin sort of leaves that behind and say, well, why not? Right? Why not perfect ourselves? Now, by the end of it, he does come to the conclusion that while he's improved himself, perfectibility isn't necessarily the ultimate goal. He talks about, he uses a metaphor of an axe and, shining and polishing the axe to perfection. And he says, ultimately, he concluded that a speckled axe is best by the end of it, right? That you sort of have to embrace your imperfections as well. So with Franklin, you've got that kind of Enlightenment sense that through application of reason and discipline, we can perfect ourselves. Thoreau isn't really interested in perfecting himself. Thoreau is interested in sucking the marrow out of life. Thoreau is interested in being as fully and completely human as he can possibly be, right? And the way to do that is simplify. The way to do that is to cut away everything that does not matter. The way to do that is to get away from those things that are keeping you from being human and to be yourself in nature, right? To imbibe the tonic of wildness, in a sense. Thoreau was an interesting guy in part because he was politically pretty radical. He was, in fact, kind of a radical libertarian in a lot of ways. He said, the government is best which governs least. But he also clarified his position. And he said, I'm not espousing that we should just get rid of all government right now. His goal, his aim, was that people in general would evolve intellectually and spiritually to such a level that government was unnecessary, right? So if everybody would undertake the process of spiritual renewal that Thoreau undertook and come to that level of enlightenment, then perhaps we wouldn't need laws and government and taxes and all those other things that he protested against. Now, that impracticality that I'm talking about with the transcendentalists is pretty clear in Thoreau, right? Because what kind of a program of societal change is, well, everybody just needs to go out in the wilderness and live the way that I lived. And then maybe if we eventually wander back together, we won't need the trappings of culture and society. And it was also, in some ways, born of a kind of privilege. Thoreau was able to live on Emerson's land. Thoreau didn't really have to worry about meeting the most basic necessities of life, and Thoreau was a white guy in an era when being a white guy was pretty much the most privileged status that you could have. And that's why I think it's interesting when we move from the radical individualism of Thoreau to Margaret Fuller. She was also very much a transcendentalist. Her writing is full of the kind of references to the soul and transcendence that animate Emerson's writing. But she was also grounded in a way that the other transcendentalists often weren't. And that grounding was because she was a woman. And she was very conscious of the systems that constrained her possibilities and what she was able to do and the kind of life that she was able to live. If transcendentalism is all about being able to grow into your best possible self spiritually and intellectually, then the constraints on women, as she saw them, were shackles that had to go, right? And so she takes some of these transcendentalist ideas and focuses them in a kind of proto-feminist way on women's suffrage and the idea of women's equality in general. So I got a quote from her there that I want us to look at. I think one of the most important things to understand in the kind of evolution of transcendentalism, and I think Fuller's a key figure in that, is that philosophically, what they eventually came to realize was that if something is true for me, then it must be true for everybody. If I can only reach my human potential and do what I'm meant to do and should do in an atmosphere of freedom and equality, then everybody else must live in an atmosphere of freedom and equality. And that's why the transcendentalists, Fuller in particular, but then eventually just about all of them, eventually sort of re-engage with the world and become activists, usually abolitionists, in some cases advocates for labor, that sort of thing. But Fuller kind of brings home these transcendentalist ideas and says, rather than just sort of disappearing into the wilderness, we need to address circumstances here that really do sort of constrain human beings. So she says, "Yet then and only then will human beings be ripe for this, when inward and outward freedom for woman as much as for man shall be acknowledged as a right, not yielded as a concession." Now this is an Enlightenment survival, that sort of Rousseauvian, Lockean idea of fundamental human rights that she's sort of bringing into this conversation now as well. Acknowledged as a right, not yielded as a concession. In other words, freedom isn't something that you give to me. Freedom is something that is fundamentally an inalienable right of mine. As the friend of the enslaved person, I kind of updated the language there to be a little more appropriate. As a friend of the enslaved person assumes that one man cannot by right hold another in bondage, should the friend of woman assume that man cannot by right lay even well-meant restrictions on woman? If the enslaved person be a soul, if the woman be a soul, apparelled in flesh, to one master only are they accountable. There is but one law for all souls, and if there is to be an interpreter of it, he comes not as man or son of man, but as son of God. So Fuller there connects women's rights, the abolitionist movement, to this sort of transcendentalist drive to become the best human beings that we can possibly be. And so in some ways becomes a kind of restorative or a kind of counterbalance to that radical hermit-like individualism of Thoreau. Rather than just disengage, rather than just flee into the woods, Fuller says, we've got to work together and we've got to acknowledge this kind of universal equality. And until we get there, then we as a species, right, are not going to attain this kind of a goal that we seek. So the transcendentalists, tremendously optimistic, full of this idea of the possibilities of self-creation, of renewal, of starting anew, enormously influential, but also, of course, as you might expect, had their share of detractors and their share of skeptics. Nathaniel Hawthorne, famously the writer of Scarlet Letter, a number of short stories. Hawthorne was skeptical by nature of this idea of jettisoning the past and starting all over. One of the sort of paradigmatic ways of understanding Hawthorne is by his lineage. He had, as he put it at one point, the sort of best and worst of America in him. One of his ancestors was a Revolutionary War hero who was central to the war effort. Another was a judge in the Salem witch trials, right? So a kind of embodiment for Hawthorne. Hawthorne was sort of obsessed in a lot of ways with Puritan America. An embodiment of that kind of original sin of America's inception that led to that kind of cruelty. And so Hawthorne saw in a lot of ways the dangers of ignoring, rejecting the past, of thinking, okay, all we need is an original relationship to the universe. He said, no, we need to think about history. We need to understand where we've come from. We need to understand our past so that we don't repeat those errors. He was also deeply skeptical of any idea of sort of perfectibility of humanity. And he wrote a wonderful story called The Birthmark. That's kind of a fable. Hawthorne sort of trafficked in fables a lot of the time. Almost a fairy tale. Has anybody read The Birthmark in here? A few? It involves this guy, a scientist named Aylmer, who's kind of an alchemist, scientist. What he does is somewhere in between magic and science, right? But he's this brilliant young man. And he marries this beautiful woman who to him seems to be the embodiment of human perfection, except she has this tiny little birthmark on her cheek that looks like a fairy's kiss. A fairy's hand had been laid upon her at birth. And Hawthorne's narrator makes the point that most of her admirers saw it as enhancing her beauty, not detracting from it. But Aylmer saw in her the possibility of perfection. Here is this person who is so close to being perfect. And he thought, I bet I can do this. I think I can apply my science, my alchemy, whatever it is that I do, right, to make this person perfect. And you've got these great sort of touches of kind of fairy tale in the Gothic. He's got this massive earthy manservant called Aminadab, who's like this Igor figure who works with him in the lab, who doesn't seem to understand anything, but it sort of does the grunt work for him. And so you got him laboring with his assistant in this lab, doing these experiments on his wife. And then finally, he comes up with this sort of mystical formula and applies it. And the hand starts to disappear. And we have this quotation here on the last one on that sheet I gave you. That fatal hand had grappled with the mystery of life and was the bond by which an angelic spirit kept itself in union with a mortal frame. As the last crimson tint of the birthmark, that sole token of human imperfection, faded from her cheek, the parting breath of the now perfect woman passed into the atmosphere, and her soul, lingering a moment near her husband, took its heavenward flight. With perfection to Hawthorne comes the loss of humanity, right? Imperfection is that thing that roots us to the human. Imperfection is that thing that makes us fundamentally human. And so that effort to achieve the perfect has to mean that sort of divorcing of the spirit from the body. And I think Hawthorne uses this in a kind of sort of fable way, right? As a commentary on all these sort of efforts towards perfectibility of humanity, right? That we're always going to be earthbound, that we are defined as much by our imperfections and our sins and our various flaws as we are by anything else. And so he stands among these sort of Boston writers as a kind of reminder of the ambiguities of life, right? A kind of corrective to that effusive optimism of the transcendentalists. But I think the thing I want you to sort of take away from this 19th century section, I'm going to move forward a little bit in a minute and talk a little bit about Robert Frost, is this energy that's coming out of Boston during this time that's centralized in both the urban center of Boston and then the sort of relatively bucolic Concord, which is where the transcendentalists and the sort of went to experience the wilderness. This sense that we are defining the American intellect, that we're defining the American scholar, that we're creating anew a kind of American intellectualism. That's why I think Boston is so exciting, right, as a kind of intellectual center. And I think so much of that comes from this tension, ironically, between city as intellectual center and that idea of nature as the place that we have to retreat to in order to nourish our intellects and in order to become who we truly have to become. I want to jump ahead now and look at a poem by Robert Frost, who of course is another famous Boston writer. Frost, writing in sort of mid-20th century America, was in some ways sort of the most famous American poet of his time, arguably the most famous American poet of the 20th century. And I think he's famous in the way that Emerson is famous because he's infinitely quotable, right? There's always some quotation from Frost that we remember. A lot of his stuff is sort of poster ready. It seems to be sort of inspirational. But I think also Frost is often misunderstood. And people take Frost's seemingly simple ideas at face value a lot of the time, when actually what Frost was a sort of deep student, and in some ways a skeptical student of human nature. So I want to look at this, The Road Not Taken, probably his most famous poem, arguably one of the most famous poems in the English language. This is one that a lot of people love, a lot of people embrace, a lot of people hold up as a kind of nonconformist hymn, right? That this is all about zigging when everybody else is zagging, that this is all about marching to the beat of your own drum, that this is celebrating the individual and individualism. Maybe, but let's take a look at it and see what it actually says. Called The Road Not Taken. A lot of people think it's called The Road Less Traveled, but it's not about that road, it's about the other road, right? Which is important to begin with. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. So in the first stanza here, rather than being sort of celebratory, right, what we get most is the sense of regret and ambivalence. Sorry I could not travel both, right? Sorry I could not take both and be one traveler. So standing there, looking down each, trying to see the future, trying to understand what would await down either of these paths. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. Okay, so the kind of graduation speech version of this poem tends to simplify this tremendously. But he's hedging throughout here, right? That perhaps is essential. Maybe it was a little bit less worn down than the other one, but really, honestly, there wasn't a whole lot of difference between the two. It's not as if here's the superhighway and here's this trail into the wilderness, and I took the trail into the wilderness because that's just the kind of guy I am, right? Instead, it's all about ambivalence. It's all about second guessing. It's all about questioning. Maybe fewer people have been down this road. I don't know. Honestly, can't say for sure. Okay, and both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. So yet another qualifier at the beginning of the next stanza, right? Really, I couldn't tell any difference between these two roads. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. So again, not a kind of triumphant and heroic charting your own course. It's, well, maybe someday I'll come back and I'll try that other road. I got to go one way today, but maybe I can come back, but I probably won't be able to, right? I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Okay. By the last stanza, we make this transition from the immediacy of the experience to this sense of how I'm going to talk about it in the future. How will I tell this thing, right? And there again, we have this ambivalence. There are a lot of reasons you could sigh. You could be sighing with contentment. You could be sighing with melancholy. right? You'd be sighing with regret. We don't know the emotion that's going to accompany this, and neither does our speaker at this point. But look at how clear the story the speaker tells himself of this moment is in comparison to all that hedging and all that second guessing up to this point. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. What Frost understood is that we are, individually and collectively, the stories that we tell ourselves, right? That what words do, the stories that we tell do, is impose order onto chaos. And that's really what all of these sort of transcendentalist efforts were to do. Yes, embrace the chaos to some extent, but also to kind of impose a kind of order on the wildness around us, a way to understand humanity, a way to understand our place in nature. And for all that embrace of the sublime, that's really kind of ultimately the goal. But what Frost is saying is that this is how people work. We take a chaotic experience that we really don't know how to interpret, have no idea how much of a difference this actually made, how different the 2 paths would have been, what the other one would have held. And when looking back, we say, that was it. That was the moment. That was the choice. I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Probably not, right? There are probably other forks in the road along the way. Probably other decisions, any number of other decisions that he could make. But seeking to understand the chaos of experience, we look back, we say, this is the story of my life. This is the way to make sense of it. This is who I am. This is what that meant. And I think what's sort of beautiful and tragic and moving about all of these American writers of the 19th century that I've talked about today is the earnestness with which they try to tell these kinds of stories, with which they try to define, this is humanity, this is what life's all about, this is how we should live. The way that they question the received pieties of the past and the received practicalities of that sort of Enlightenment era. And I don't know if it's for the last time in American history, but engage in truly questioning what life is supposed to be about. And that's what's kind of moving to me about this. Now, it seems kind of quaint now to think about Thoreau and to think about the wilderness in the way that we do. But I think in some ways it's at least as salient in this era as it's ever been. That idea that we've got to simplify, that idea that we're caught up all the time in distractions. We have more distractions now than any other time in history, right? Many of us can't even content ourselves with one screen at a time, right? We'll sit there with the TV on and a laptop open and a phone, right? And maybe some headphones in listening to something else. Filling up the silence in any way possible. And it's interesting, I've noticed relatively recently, and of course my recent is different from my students' recent, relatively recently, one of the kind of pieces of slang that I've heard more and more often is that sort of exhortation to touch grass. Like if somebody's a little bit too online, if somebody's a little bit too obsessed in the things that don't really matter, the minutiae of the internet, somebody would say, you need to go touch some grass, right? That desire, or that human need to disconnect sometimes and to reconnect even in the slightest way or the smallest way with nature. And so I would encourage you, now that you've heard the semi-learned astronomer laying all this out in charts and graphs, to go forth and to touch some grass this afternoon and to appreciate nature on a beautiful day. And eventually to touch some grass in Boston as well. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.